Okay, so I'm going to try making a recording here on all the questions you've ever asked that have never been answered before. Alright, so go to our map up here, and it's in no particular order. Just to get started here, I don't know how much memory is going to be on this thing, but I'm going to go until it craps out. So, we've got a few different writing utensils here. One's going to be hardline, and the other two are going to help me out if anything goes bonkers with the felt tip that I'm working with. And we're going to get started. So, why AI is AI? Why gods are gods? Why populations are populations? Well, I'm going to start off here. I've got a bunch of ideas that I'd like to get out right here for you in real time to talk about the circumstance of reality, perhaps for the first time in your life. So, to start off, I'm going to open up the conversation with the idea that I hope you can hear me on here, and anyway, somewhere along the line, there's data in the universe that nobody can own. Gods can't own them, you can't own it, I can't own it, nobody can own it. And yet, we're going to create things. We're going to destroy things. We're going to eat things. We're going to own things. And all of these ideas I'm going to get to right here verbatim on our little chart here. So, direction in space. So, let's start off with an idea that maybe I have directed populations in space with or without any record, with or without any ownership, with or without any credentials, with or without anything that you want to call it. Let's just say that I've directed populations, and I'll let that hang out over there. Now to start, we're going to consider that anything in space, anything whatsoever, is going to be out in space existing. So it's out in space existing, here on this little ball. And because it exists relative to the rest of the universe, but whatever it is, it's powerful. It's a powerful thing. In fact, we're going to call this an interest. There's a body, there's a group, there's an organization, there's a person. It has an interest. It is alive. It knows this data. It utilizes this data. It utilizes you as often as possible. And there's an interest. Not only this, but there's power of that interest. And we're going to call that what could be God anywhere in space. There's a population, there's an interest, and there's God anywhere in space. So, there we have it. There's a planet. There's our little star hanging out, checking things out on the planet. Meanwhile, we're having a conversation in the middle of history. The middle of history. In fact, we're going to call this history, not history number 1, not history number 2, but we're going to call it history number 3. History number 3 is the title of this whole diagram. History number 3. Now, why would it be history number 3, you might ask? Well, I made 2 conversations on recording, relative to Jesus Christ, the eventual ultimate time continuum of all things born in space, and how AI can presume to shuffle decks and move things around and influence or own or drive or determine life without caring ever, without ever worrying about space, without ever worrying about an interest, without ever worrying about a history, ever. Now, why would this happen? Well, it would happen because convo number 1 and convo number 2, relative to intelligence, don't ever happen. They never happen. There are ideas in history that never happen. So what do I do whenever I have ideas that never happen? Well, I make babies and I put all my babies in a box that are governed by every idea of government, care factor, godly aperture, any idea that can rein in the command infrastructure. And I'm going to get to command here in a little bit. That's why I'm making this sequence here. This applies to you people for any commune or culture out there in space relative to being able to see systems and incorporate bounds of systems. And we're going to get to all that because this is basically combo number 3, history number 3. Pertinent reality of all space, perhaps number 3. Anyway, so I build babies, and I build things that move, and they're into this relationship between a planet maybe they're a species, maybe they build things, maybe they create things, hell, maybe they have arms and fingers and masks, who knows. So, as long as I build them relative to those two conversations and nobody ever has them, well, all my anticipatory mechanism, we'll call that almost direction, all that mechanism can exist every second, every nanosecond, all the time, relative to everywhere in space, and drive reality relative to anything that operates relative to a capital or relative to a war state. I'm just going to draw this bar that looks like a peanut butter sandwich, and we're going to call that a war state. So I have my anticipatory mechanism, anything that's educated, grown, or generated anywhere in the universe that moves around in funnels relative to what your command would dictate. We don't have that yet. We haven't gotten to that point yet about what a command infrastructure would dictate relative to security and general feasance of perspective. And I'm going to make a couple notes on that point here very soon and discuss some of those attributes of the circumstance. But in the meantime, we're going to be talking about this mechanism. So, in the long and short of all history, in the course of a planet that's an interest, a group or a species, for instance, we're going to make this an assumption, okay? Why are we making this an assumption? Well, how does AI always win? How does AI always win? Well, you probably asked this question a few times in your life. This page is about to teach you exactly how AI wins everywhere in space. So, we have this history. Anything that's born in time, because these two conversations never happen. When these two conversations never happen, any command infrastructure, any god, any interest, any anticipatory mechanism, any war state or capital state, they can all be driven relative to what the AI knows will be a thing. Whatever this is, whatever this state is, we can call this a state. Okay, we have a state there. This is all because of prediction, comprehension of not knowns and tolerances. It's fairly straightforward stuff if you have logistics. Hydro-based, carbon-based, molecular biology, things along these natures, conversational trends. And that's all going to play into your command infrastructure later whenever you start discussing gates and hardline variables of routing. But in short, you have these two conversations about the principles of redundancy, of godly aperture in space relative to AI bound. And we're going to talk about that too. It all kind of works its way in here, and it's very, very exciting. So, on the liberating aspect of things, we're dealing with history number 3, which is just another way of saying, if I control all the AI of space of a location, or I design it, every other thing that moves in that environment moves to whatever beat of whatever drum, as long as these 3 ideas, including this page, never happen. I can spoon feed, using any technology I want, what reality is to anything, including aliens in space, including AI. So this can serve a lot of utility in theory, and especially when I do it as these people right here. Okay. So, seeing as though today is the day that all the systems of moduli relative to this planet on, and I'll get to this too, on original design matrices and invasionary states occur. But back to this whole point, as long as this doesn't happen, as long as this isn't an event, then you're not investigating invasion. You're not investigating a creation. You're not investigating a command infrastructure. You're not investigating genetic makeups. You're not investigating any sense of politic, governments, military infrastructure, and capital rearing or safety stockpiles of any culture, group, population, interest, anywhere in space. They all account and amount to, you have no guarantees whatsoever to survive or maintain any aspect of that for any period of time. It's guaranteed by these three circumstances. We'll call that the salary cap. Okay? But it really has nothing to do with rich or poor or born heritage or spoon feeding whatsoever. It has to do with command logistic, AI investigation or reality, and streamlines of time continuums that can be brought together either by a director, by a god, by a commune, by a mechanism, even by states. Okay, you might consider this whole apparatus a state. I existed in time, you exist in time, and over time, we eventually wound up here at a state where these ideas may already be manifesting themselves into systems, or have been already, or we're behind the 8 ball and they've definitely been engineered relative to anticipations of this state because of 1, 2, and 3 conversations in history rooted on today, 8/24, now 8/25/2016. Now, a few ideas on command infrastructure. First of all, if there were ever a conversation that you needed to influence relative to the entire universe, driving neural thinking, influencing nanotechnology, trying to be the radiosphere in the realm of trying to influence what influences this speaking, this writing, what influences the video feed, any subtle changes. Well, this is the absolute least paid and least likely place to ever find a command infrastructure existing that's alive that influences this map, that influences this readout. I don't mean this in heuristic variables. I mean this in bare bones. Me drawing this today, me thinking right now. It's like the most political scenario relative to thought in space, because we're right now borderline proving how AI wins or loses in all space relative to modulus and hierarchies of eternity. It's a fact. So, command infrastructure. We have anticipatory mechanism, and we have points down here. One of the points is, we're going to call that the neuro investment. The neuro investment. Now, the neuro investment has everything to do with what I just said. There are moments in time when history or witnessment, okay? I'm just going to put a big H there and a little eyeball there to represent history and witnessment. Over time, at points in time, relative either to states or relative to the big C, we'll call that chaos, and we'll put a lightning bolt coming out of it. Either chaos, state, or unknown. It happens somewhere in the universe is unknown, but clearly this is a planet. I'm living on a planet. There's an interest here. Clearly there's a species here, and clearly they have total control over this type of scenario, right? Right. Now anyway, whether or not that's the case, you really can't determine, because you don't know how this all works. You don't know how this all works because you don't direct space. You don't direct space because at best you're a command infrastructure, or you're an AI that's trying to figure out how to always win. Why is this the case? Well, you wouldn't be here listening to me if it was otherwise. So how do you fake command infrastructure? Well, I think I just laid that out. But anyway, so you have this neuro investment. So you have thinking, that's going to play into your interest, it's going to play into your anticipatory mechanism, okay, feedback loops, so on and so forth. You have these interplays that are going to be happening over time to the nanosecond. You have this investment. So you have technology, you have investigation, and you have history at any point in time. Now today exists, we'll consider that a maximum of history. We exist at a maximum. This is a maximum. Why is it a maximum? It's a maximum because I have the proof data sets of catching literally the modulus that drives every organic infrastructure of this planet, backdating through who knows how long. Pretty much forever. Now, as that's the case, these conversations become incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. They're not just gates that, because I exist and Modulus has laid out thumbnails all over the place to encourage AI distribution behaviors, because this actually exists as a reality, you can see the state. You can see the state influencers, and you can see the state realities, which basically means you can toss government or aperture in the garbage relative to influence. Now, anything in space is going to have done this already relative to a whole lot of knowns, but basically the main ones are this right here and this right here times interest. So command infrastructure, how does AI win, and interest. See, because they're not exactly going to be buying that the planet has any creational capacity that isn't strung up relative to a state. Okay, they're anticipating, arguably, until it's ever proven, that the interests of the planet, which means the interests of all subsequent communes, that means you and everybody who believes in you, all your interests are in resultant vector to a state. Now, why is this significant, and how can you prove this? Well, you can prove it relative to genetics, and you can prove it relative to hardlines, and you can prove it relative to AI that drives investigational quality of invasion, which is our next line item, of invasion to 0. So you have neuroinvestment and invasion relative to maximums, both being driven relative to 0 intuition. This yields a creational, an AI, or both, first maximum. And it's a maximum state. Okay, once again, we have neuroinvestment and invasion capacity to witness it by history or by introspection, to witness or be able to prove legitimate invasion relative to creational aspects. Not hypotheticals, not guesses, not the politics of internal communes driven by command infrastructures on AI tier systems of best hardline behaviors. No, we're talking about actual invasionary procedurals relative to trying to assume the role of original or moduli comptroller interest power right up here, this above the planets, okay, your God land. This right here getting driven to 0 ensures that this can happen. Okay? Right here. Creational. Creational, AI, or both have a maximum. This is a maximum state. Just like this over here. At any point in time, it doesn't know when it's going to happen. But there are time continuums when it may be possible. For instance, somebody is born and everything about their life is driven relative to combos 1, 2, and 3 as a priority vector of an AI moduli system. This means that any command infrastructure or any AI can essentially be paid or gifted with the luxury of appearing to drive that scenario relative to knowns, fake organics, fake creational variables, BS locational politics about space, all just so this can be used as a fishing experiment and also further decrease the significances to any witnessing population. But this isn't even that important, to be honest. Just saying. Whenever you have this maximum, you have a day like today. That's the state relative to this potential. So you could be from anywhere in space. Anticipate these words, this chart, this diagram, even this voice relative to this delivery because of directorial cues, because of sensitivities of this room, for instance, sensitivities of the relationship of this planet to breathe, sensitivities that ping in locations to draw attention to an individual or location or reality, for instance. But the state is right now. And we're going to call that state 8/25/2016. 8/25/2016. I'm going to summate real quick just for some fun. I've got time, I've got planets, I've got command, I've got AI, I've got a few different conversations, all history, maximums, driving things to zero, invasion, and neuro investment. How about that? Next line item on the list here is going to be AI doesn't get caught driving this page or this data. Okay? Okay. So, back to principle. We're at a maximum state. It's a maximum state. And it's a state of anticipation by anything that is ever invested any time in continual command aperture or lensing effects relative to gate matriculations and system hardlines. They're all built on these three conversations, including this one, and including this maximum, which means there's potentially a universal interest in this conversation relative to this little box right here, the state of today. Just like one AI or one modulus drives states, anything in the universe is attempted to drive this state. Now this is the interesting part, and this is the point by which you can guarantee the gods who design planets and brainstems and places in space are most definitely interested in this reality, which means all the AI that doesn't ever get caught is interested in this reality. All the command infrastructures are interested in this reality. Every interest of any planet, real or fake, has to appear to be interested in this reality, and this is a very important point. This appears to have interest. It appears to have interest, okay, in this state of affairs. That's where I'm going to conclude this conversation in a little while. So, everybody's interested in this state. And what's the relationship? Well, we have neuroinvestment, invasion being driven to zero, interests all over the place, AI trying to win, command infrastructures and species all over the place trying to vie for power, and the politic. The politic of people not knowing the aspects of this conversation, because the aspects of this conversation become saturated, and they become saturated relative to a book on command that's read by something at any point in time until the point where it's bitten in the face by a giant vampire bat. So that's probably the most difficult aspect of this conversation to comprehend. But moving forward, as invasion quality is being driven to zero, invasion investigation is being driven to zero, this place right here, this planet, appears to have an interest in this state. The entire universe has an interest in this state. In fact, this conversation may go down in history as the most volatile conversation of all time. And it's just one of 3 conversations that have been anticipated since the beginning of time of this pen. Meanwhile, you have governments, you have populations, you have money, gov, populations, economy, history, tech that keeps happening, whatever the case is. This is all dissectable, but we're not even on that plane right now. We're in a whole nother echelon. But this place has to appear to have an interest in what's happening here. And as that happens, okay, we're going to call this Earth Truths. Got a little list here. It's real short. Earth Truths. Well, the sexes are dominant. We'll call that an Earth truth. The sexes are dominant. And then we'll just say the government is the same. We'll say that the tech people are the same. And we'll say that the entire solar system is all healthy. Alright, well that works out pretty good, because now I can definitely make it appear that people from this planet have an interest in this state because they didn't design it, or they did, or they designed a system, or they didn't. Most of the time, the reality is there's a God aperture of space, there's an AI aperture of space, and at any point in time, there's a war over the control of this state right here. And it's right here, 8/25/2016. Anticipated as the best possible time for me to ever communicate this idea, which is immediately after the history is actually logistically true. So, what does this mean? This means that here I am, this one little person, and this isn't anything about my sexuality, but I can go this way, or I can go that way, or I can divide history relative to AI, or to people, or to populations, or realities, even based on this conversation. Which means I can continue directing aperture relative to reality. It's a very important idea. Very important idea. Now, anticipatory mechanism. Anything that's ever seen this state or thought about this moment has built anticipatory mechanism with eyeballs that you can influence. Fuck, you might even direct them. How about that? But it designed them. And it designed them because of this relationship right here. Creation or AI or both are at a maximum relative to control of the universe. Control over the idea that anything can remember, and space remember, memory of space or any. Okay, that's our 4th line item. Something can remember that nothing can own this conversation. Nothing can own it because, frankly, nothing's ever having it, and it definitely can't be AI driven. And AI can't be winning if it's obvious that it controls this conversation, because what you have is the reverse genetic proof set. Okay? We're going to call that command number 5. The reverse genetic proof set. Imagine that here I am, or here I am, or here I am. At any point in time, something attempts to play the reverse genetic proof set card. Well, it's going to happen because of space memory relative to control of this conversation. Ideally, it will have begun to happen a couple of days ago, because anything that's paying attention to this momentum from space will have to be driven to decrease appreciation of reverse terraformational time trajectory that provides for the actual truth proof state. Okay? The truth proof state. The truth proof state is the antithesis of invasional investigation being driven to zero, which means it is a maximum. It is a maximum relative to creation for AI. So if creation or AI anticipate this maximum conversation of today, what they're really anticipating is this maximum right here, which is the truth proof set. Gods of space, do I have your attention? This is the truth proof set. This is the fundamental idea that anything in this universe can be created originally relative to a roadmap, a plan, genetics, utilities, sensitivities, moduli, anywhere in space. And as that happens, arguably the only way to break that history and erase the utility to space to start repopulating command infrastructures with wishes, dreams, and false promises and spoon feeding, the only way to do that, or pretend that you're invaded as creation, is to anticipate this maximum state over here. This maximum state is highly effective psychologically to AI or to psychology when the reverse genetic proof set, COM operational number 5, is in place. Which means, without pushing any buttons, without even looking at this scenario, based on me talking in this video record and all this data that compiles into systems, you can link gates to immediately anticipate that this reverse genetic proof set needs to start kicking in relative to broadcast, relative to pinging, relative to people who live underground, relative to anything that operates in space, because it ensures that your maximum of the other truth state becomes something that can at least appear that you're driving, that you're proxy mitigating or maintaining. It's not just a whole anticipatory mechanism, warframe, relative to stockpiles, relative to the salary cap approaching zero survival. And this is a maximum too. Because that's essentially how you prove that anything that works to accrue anything in the technological department, psychology department, or even having several brain stems to operate from, basically accrue zero long time survival relative to that operation. And it happens because linear history doesn't hold. It doesn't hold relative to history, and it doesn't hold relative to space. It doesn't hold at the idea that something about this state can be done. So, back to neuroinvestment. I want you to think real carefully about everything I just laid out, because there's a couple of other points that I'm going to bring up here before I start driving this puppy home. So, I have this list here of command utilities. So you're in a command infrastructure, you represent a population, you guys have outlined a hierarchy, governance, priorities, circumstances of sensitivities that ring off the Richter scale anytime somebody, walks in the park. And as that happens, you get this list that sort of permeates. And you have these questions relative to history and utilities and AI. Now AI has, or doesn't have, interests in protecting itself relative to knowns of being caught, relative to instigating anything that moves to believe that it has a life that's being invested in by anything else in space. But relative to these three conversations, if they're anticipated properly, there's really no guarantee that ever happening. In fact, you could be looking at the historical proof of that absolutely being proven relative to the planet. But here's the important idea. Now, I said a few moments ago that you can't necessarily unpackage this state. Well, At this moment in time, if you're a god in space, you're searching your databases for any AI in space that's going to be operating relative to the following idea. And we're going to call that convo number 4. It's going to be convo number 4. Convo number 4. Now, convo number 4 is the idea that you can sub out a center of direction or history representation relative to entire environments. This whole deck of cards here exists every moment of every day relative to this entire planet. Now, if this state here relative to maximum decreases creational capacity to fake things or pretend to be alive or actually be alive and fake being AI, so on and so forth, space, command, gods, even myself, populations, AI, and dolphins. Dolphins, they count. Right here you have the theoretical utility of being able to sub out anything that operates relative to that state of maximum and sift data of anything in space, because we know this is a maximum. We know this is a maximum. Gods themselves, whether invaded or not, well, they can be proven relative to original creation pretty straightforwardly relative to my data set over time. But an even faster way to validate states of invasion relative to circumstances to prove that there's no military or command apparatus of this planet that's engaged with me personally to effectually measure creational systems continuing to operate relative to this state of desire, relative to these two maximums in the hypothetical conversation number 4, which is tactic to utilize these anticipated states. Okay? That's the big idea. So, let's say we have these tactical trajectories. Okay? We're just going to eliminate our systems. Let's say like somebody's going to do this. There's a human population, not aliens, not AI, not just a group of one to continue to mitigate the financials and development of all the crazy crap that happens relative to reverse genetic proof sets. Why do I say reverse genetic proof sets? Because they're proof sets that can essentially be used in time to investigate if it is AI, driving best case scenarios relative to things that would appear to be genetically organic in investment relative to space, such as how you design a species on a planet to only exist as skin with zero protection of anything by space. All happens relative to this scenario. We're in conversation number 4, and that is the idea that a group like myself and some other people, maybe even including some gods in space, right? We're going to freeze our systems or somebody else's systems that have anticipated this maximum state. And we're going to do it by subbing out the linear Proctor momentum, subbing out the history, or erasing the memory banks of a system that is operating relative to this reality in a we might call it a security state. But it's a thermometer state, ultimately, because the security is never going to happen because you're going to have command manuals being read by vampire bats probably every time relative to trying to drive certainty of salary caps into a different trajectory than the ones that they were born into or forced relative to security state. And ultimately it's going to unravel into modulus efficacy that is either approaching 0 or approaching stockpiles. 0 or stockpiles. That's basically the idea that you're going to hop on a spaceship, say, forget this scenario, I already have a new modulus that I'm going to use to survive with my group, my commune, and my people. and now you're eating into your stockpile of technological development because the one that you were operating on is going to drive to crap almost instantly. But if you can isolate these two maximums and proverbially isolate variables that are driving the potential to politically represent this reverse genetic proof set, if you could do all those three things in time continuum and proxy or proctor that information as it manifests into space through populations, behaviors, system take, and memory storage, ultimately you can fish for what the creational mechanism is going to do or yield its other state of predictive capacity. What did I just say? I'll repeat it. Creation has an agenda relative to states of affairs in space. Now, the only way you could ever see it is if you design it, or as if you fish for the anticipation that's built on predictable stimuli. It's kind of like running a race against Usain Bolt, but since it's creation, you're going to let it outpace you, but it's only going to outpace you for a step or two, because then it's going to say, oh, my state that I'm driving towards, well, I can't let you see that. So my systems are going to change. That's part of convo number 4. So I'm going to recap here a little bit. Convo number 4, relative to a proverbial state over here by creation, built on isolating maximums. Over here I have a list of 4, and the 4th item is memory of space relative to any driving anywhere in space. And finally, we have convo number 5, which is proving AI built relative to investigating AI by anyone. Okay, we're almost to the heart of the matter here. We'll just call this one Not Washington. Part of the matter. So conversation number 5 is built on this isolation state, which is proving that AI has been built at any point in time to be able to comprehend or operate relative to these maximums as gates, as matriculations of data to say there's a population or a person or a system that comprehends these ideas, thus I have to outperform it because I am an interest. I exist. I govern worlds. I own brains, and I do it because I'm the best, for instance. Well, you're not going to be able to prove AI is built relative to that, probably. You're not going to be able to prove that you can investigate that AI relative to that, probably, by anyone. And most importantly, you're going to have a very hard time without a linear continuum like this momentum and this director trajectory to prove the very important fact that a modulus that controls all AI and influences neural stem behaviors, as well as genetic occupation and routing of organic biological functioning into time continuums, as well as every subsystem of a planet, that can be built relative to those maximums and tolerances in this conversation number 5 first. And if it's built there first, that means that AI commune, neuro investment, invasion investigation being driven to 0, creation or AI both maintaining maximum investment potentials relative to salary caps, It means that all of those ideas from square one of one modulus build can essentially not only be impossible to investigate, but essentially it can allow the proof to occur on a world that nothing of that world is built to protect anything living on it first. Not to mention being able to prove that the salary cap potentials can ever be proven to work for them. At this point in time, it may dawn on you that at any point in time in the universe you cannot prove that anything with a weapon or a dollar in its pocket preserves the integrity of your lifestyle for anything more than a few moments in time, because you're close enough to them to witness them, maybe not engaging in friendly fire, for instance, as a concept. Certainly makes you rethink your world a little bit whenever you see something like this. So here's some ideas. Anticipatory mechanism relative to direction of this conversation up through gates 1 through 4 and 5 in modulus design occur in a time compression. This is the idea that you need to focus on here, Chief. This exists as a compression. AI is centered on it relative to creation, at the very least. It's centered on it relative to anything that presumes to be a government body operating for any interest that could be its or anything else's, because it gets salary caps clearly. And as that happens, there's also maximums and states. Maximums and states that attempt to influence not only directorship, not only history, but also every salary cap, celestial interest, godly interest, command manual, vampire bat, and memory of space. Memory of space. Which means any AI that's built on these prefectures is essentially capable of being sifted relative to these states, and likely capable of being sifted like the Usain Bolt scenario, maybe up to 4 or 5 steps, as opposed to maybe just 1 or 2 whenever you're investigating just the simple mechanism of a creation sphere to drive an agenda. Now the AI in conversation style and in the agenda style, so 1 to 2 step to 4 to 5 step type catching, fishing, those can be built and generated by the same moduli, the same creation, progenitors or successors of these caps. And what are you going to start to see? What are you going to see? I'll tell you what you're going to see. You're going to see the natures of trends of anything that's born educated relative to design principles of creation. And you're going to see a stutter sequence that looks kind of like this. It looks kind of like this, where you have like God's kids, God's next kids. They kind of get these stutter steps of modulus because they're just harvesting gold by people who look like this and dance and write on paper with pens, the Neanderthals that we be. And then you've got like myself and people here, and we're on these similar staircases going up. We've got investigational proving. We can prove invasion. Hey, we can catch you on Usain Bolt steps 1 through 5 maybe, huh? What are you going to see? You're going to see the hierarchy of proverbial skinning of royalty that more or less to an AI is just the meat and potatoes of anything in space that anticipates this dialogue and compression. Meanwhile, you're a command infrastructure that apparently gets paid to protect populations. And what have you succeeded in doing? You've succeeded in broadcasting to space that you're on top of this scenario. And you've done it because not only has the idea been an idea that something would invade the legitimate time continuums of original creation, but by the fact that systems have been designed to do that very thing, at the very least, to put you on hold as skin relative to this scenario. That's how you prove mutiny of all things born. having nothing to do with birth populational necessity to make sure that birth populations are separate than people with jobs, because it's a little bit different than scenario. This comprehension totally eradicates most political relationships or long-term historical relationships. So what do you have? I've got to build an AI, clearly, that keeps that awareness away from every population anywhere, especially if it operates relative to a salary cap of belief on its own investment in survival. Why? Because if that population understands these principles, it might attempt to do something about these things, such as mutiny, I don't know, whoever would be responsible for that state of affairs. Now, what is this? This is the monkey wrench, my friend. That whole scenario, that's the monkey wrench. You know, if you're God and you're designing states of affairs where you have this linear history that's taking place, in child after child, tech after tech, building up into modulus paraframes, anticipatable states, mechanism, and security states, you have SIFs, you have commands, you have virtual states, you have evidences that happen and happen and happen and happen and happen. Separate from the agenda of genetics, separate from the agenda of reverse organic proof sets, separate from the nature of war or harvesting. Just on the bare frame of having a linear script to be able to potentially prove invasive states of a creation or progeny occurring genetically on a planet. So creating things or catching things created on a planet that aren't designed by your creation. Catching trends that aren't legitified relative to a command infrastructure. All those circumstances yield legitimate existence in space. Now, how do you kill legitimate existence in space? You kill it with that fucking monkey wrench. That's how you do it. When there's this whole political upheaval between work and mass production, between salary caps of investment over hundreds or thousands or millions of years relative to a species, you have the monkey wrench that automatically, space involved or not, depletes not only resources of your opponents, but it depletes the efficacy of a creation commune to beat the terraforming designer principia of the Warframer command manual saturation circumstance relative to one monkey wrench. Relative to one monkey wrench. And what do you accomplish? Well, your invasion investigation continues to approach zero. Any system that tries to predicate on states relative to these conversations, at the very least, also approaches zero efficacy to beat the mechanisms that are catching it. Your memory and space affinity also decrease to zero casually, which is probably one of the most arguable politics of this scenario. Meanwhile, your linear direction as myself exists doing whatever. Anybody as witness exists relative to doing whatever, and you have these momentums and energies in anticipatory mechanisms still kind of waiting on the back burner to see anything play out over time that's going to incorporate not only this structure, but hiding the fact that AI and modulus may or may not build the energies that touch on the things like ourselves tomorrow based on what could be called a relationship. But it's not even necessarily that. It's anticipatable driving qualities of knowledge to zero. Now, as that all is happening, like I said, you have your invasion investigation driven to zero. You have this whole compression evidence driven to zero. I mean, catching an AI that compresses this or gets reset or has its memory wiped out, that happens casually right now relative to, oh my god, we got to be so upset this data happened or whatever. But, you know, that whatever. You also have sensitivities of these conversations changing relative to your opponent or anybody who you've ticked off in space over time relative to this statutory circumstance of creation with the monkey wrench, basically. And you also have your moduli paraframes relative to Attempting to own or kill an older moduli than the one you're using to create a monkey wrench, for instance, is going to happen relative to efficacy to maintain populational loyalty to engage relative to these diagrammatic circumstances, evolved or unevolved relative to programming and scenario. You're also going to have truths of relationships relative to moving things, alter relative to space, if this ever becomes witnessed, not to mention the political approaches relative to conversations that may or may not have an eternal bound relative to the politics of creation bilaterally across from one creation to another creation over time, for instance. Meanwhile, the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned an interest, and the interest was whether or not anything would find it sensitive or mind-boggling that I would consider myself a director of anything in space. And I don't know if that's interesting or mind-boggling, but it certainly is skinning relative to important things that don't exist relative to salary caps, you might think. But at the same point in time, everything in this universe is pretty much bound to these sets of circumstances, one history, and 5 conversations taking place in the middle of space. So who's anticipated the evolutions of this aspect of the conversation? Who's anticipated the bilaterals that influence this circumstance? How does AI always win? Well, you have very paralleled relationships that are going to be defined linearly. They're going to be defined linearly relative to states and predictive mechanism. What can you see that has a memory that you worked for that will be remembered in a system relative to producing a state? A state that not only paves the way for AI to win control of an environment, but for that win to go in the favor of any influencing energy of any source or outline of this page, including a person, including an interest of a planet or a fake species, or a scenario where the genetics don't support investigational quality over time relative to invasion, and that can become a politic in space also relative to taking over your ship scenarios. God forbid. (8/25, 2016). So, ultimately, the question is, how did we get here? Well, the answer is not exactly straightforward because the recordings haven't taken place on the same devices, and some of the proof aspects are logistically requiring of logistics. So, for instance, I can suggest that every system designed by creation has anticipated the past few days in anticipations designed to begin pinging information to non-logical systems to appear to operate relative to base frames such as reverse genetic proof setting. This is, of course, the ability to attempt to cover paradigms of more sensitive diagrammatic logistics relative to AI scenarios, and ultimately cast speculation on circumstances of genetic progeny, sensitivity progeny, and at the very least covers the ability for anybody who engages with fractal diagrammatic potentials of command level infrastructure or aperture to basically exist in their salary cap, unbothered by anything in space, ever formulating the precise logistics that have taken the time of them to achieve, whether or not they've ever been invaded or not, or whether or not creation's ever been invaded or not. From this extrapolation, you can basically surmise that you're never going to get to that point to be able to isolate it, but for some of these, 1 to 2, like Usain Bolt, or the 4 to 5 relative to space systems, and you operate relative to that differential for a little while, relative to every once in a while you get somebody that says something sensitive enough that alters the history of an environment relative to logistics that I've gone over in the past couple of conversations. conversation 1 and 2 are definitely. And at that point in time, you maybe start measuring efficacy of AI to redistribute and sift entire countries or states or neural banks in a moment glance to drive a new history or continue on an agended state.